Evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleworks online art lectures. Before we begin, I'd like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501c3c not-for-profit organization. Our Winter 3 session will start on February 27th, and classes are now open for registration on our website, atelierflowerfield.org. We offer a variety of fine art drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both in studio and online. We offer classes in illustration and digital painting as well, and have created a group of portfolio prep classes for students wishing to apply for art schools. All of these details can be found on our website. We also have a variety of paintings for sale on our online art shop, which again is on our website. Our current exhibition is showing works by Dennis Ponso. They are watercolors. That will come to an end on February 22nd. And the next exhibition is our second annual middle school and high school student artist juried show. That opens on March 2nd, but the actual reception for it will be on March 4th, which is a Saturday, and that will be from 12 till 2. The gallery is open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Sorry, Monday through Saturday, I beg your pardon. Tonight, new Atelier instructor Beth Drucker is presenting a lecture and demonstration on gouache painting. We welcome her this evening and hope you enjoy tonight's demo. And if you wish to ask questions, you can actually ask them throughout the lecture. You can put them in the chat room and I will try and pick them up as we go along. I shall now hand over to Beth.
Hey, everybody. Glad you could be here. I have been an artist for more years than I care to count, but I started out as a fashion illustrator and then morphed into doing fine art and painting. And gouache has always been my main medium, simply because it is so versatile. I started out using watercolor. I love watercolor as well, but I found it to be personally a bit frustrating because I couldn't get the opaque surfaces that I wanted to get. When I was in school, we were instructed to only use gouache, so I went back to gouache and I've been using it ever since for every kind of painting that I do. You can use it like as you would use watercolor. All you need to do is add more water. But the great thing is you can use it also the way people would use acrylics. In other words, you would get an opaque color or surface with it. You can get any texture in the world with it. And so depending on what your style is, whether you want to use it more like a watercolor with a lot of water and a lot of translucent and transparencies, that's fine. And then you could also go back in and add some opaque touches to it, or if you're more of if your style is more graphic, you'll love it because you're going to get super rich, beautiful color with it. It works very much like watercolor does. As I said, with the exception that you can mix and get complete opaque color with it. And so that's really basically the difference between gouache and watercolor. Watercolor is beautiful. I love it. I just happen to have more of a graphic style, so I enjoy putting the solid colors into my paintings as well. And so when I run my classes, everyone has a different style. Everyone has a different subject matter that they like to use or that they enjoy painting. And depending on what that is, you know, gouache will be able to do that for you. You can use it like acrylics. You can use it like watercolors. It sounds like this fancy thing that no one's ever heard of. However, it's centuries old, goes back to ancient times. Toulouse-Lautrec used it in his posters, and way, way, way back before that. So what they do when they're making the gouache as opposed to watercolor is they add more pigment and some special binders. They used to use KC, now they're using another one that's a little less expensive, and that changes over the years. But that's what gives you the solidness of the look of the paint. Comes in these tubes. If you're a watercolor artist and you use tube watercolors, you'll be familiar with that. Gouache does come in pan form as well. However, if you're mixing a large amount of a color, I always find that the tubes are just much easier to use and much easier to deal with. And I've been using the same brand forever. And there are a lot of good ones out there now. So I prepared 2 partial demos. The thing that I really love about it is you can paint on black watercolor paper as well as white. Sometimes you need to do a few coats, as I had to do with the salt and pepper shakers that I have here. But most times you really don't. It covers really, really beautifully. And if I could, let me just take one of the tubes out. Here's some burnt sienna. You could tell when I take the top off of the tube, if it comes out, it's thick. It's really thick. So if I take it and I put it down on my little plastic palette here, you could see how thick it is. If you want an opaque surface, you use less water, obviously. And if you want a translucent or transparent surface, you add a lot of water to it. And then basically you're using it as watercolor. I just really enjoy mixing the 2 techniques together. I find that you could pretty much do anything with it. The only difference between using this and acrylics with the solid color is that, of course, acrylic is basically liquid plastic. So, you know, it won't get damaged when it gets wet. Gouache needs to be under glass when you finish it, just like watercolor does, because if it gets wet, it will reactivate. You can mix the color right on your painting. You can mix it on the palette. You can do both. You can use the same brushes that you would be using with watercolor. You can ponce, you can use textures, you can pretty much do anything with it. One little trick that I found from my years in teaching is these little makeup brushes.
I can't see it up there. You got it.
Okay, so when you use these, say you have a spot on one of your paintings and you really didn't intend for it to be there, or you don't like it, if you just wet the sponge and put it on the painting that you just finished, it will pick the pigment right back up. Maybe not all of it, depending on how much pigment you had, but say you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, I want a little bit more light shot on this particular area. It's too dense. Use these little sponges. They're very inexpensive. You can just pick up bunches of them, and you can actually use them as a tool, just the way people who draw use kneaded erasers, because they're so pliable. So that's something that I really, really love. I know a lot of watercolor artists like to use masking fluid. I myself don't, but you can if you want to, and I have some over here. Sometimes if you want to do, I'll say cat's whiskers or something like that, and you're painting a large area, this will certainly act as a resist. Another thing that I do is I use watercolor pencils to sketch out my drawings before I start painting them. And the reason is they come in all these fantastic colors. If any of you, if you've ever used watercolor and you've sketched something out and then painted over it, you find out rather quickly that the lead is there to stay. There's no way you're getting it up. If you use the pencil and then you add, let me see, just add some water to it. Like this was the pencil that I used to sketch out this Himalayan poppy. Okay. And so then I would just take a clean brush, just add water. And once it gets wet, it melts right into the paper and can become part of your painting because there's no wax in there. So it doesn't act as a resist. Hope you can see that. Also, sometimes after I finish a painting, if I feel that I want, I don't know, a little bit more texture or something a little bit different, you can use it with pastels, you can use it with ink, and then you can take your watercolor pencils and go back in with your pencils if you have something super, super detailed and you feel you have more control. Sometimes I'll do that as well. Although I have, you know, I mostly use my brushes, but I do use the pencils to sketch out my drawings before I paint them. And it has all the basic colors. If it's not exact, it doesn't matter because it will mix right in once you start painting. So I used this particular pencil is, I think it's olive green. Well, I call it pear. And I sketched it out to get more of the yellow in there. And once I started painting with it, now this, I'm using it like the gouache like watercolor now. It will melt right in, and you don't have to worry about any lead showing through. I know some people prefer to use regular lead pencils. I just personally happen to have a heavy hand when I draw, so this just works better for me. And as you can see, I'm just adding some more color onto this right now. And so then I would let this dry. If you look at the other side of it that I did complete, what I did was I put the base color or the wash down first, let it totally dry, and then went in and used the gouache really, really thickly with a very small detail brush to get all these small little hairs on it. Then when I was painting the flower that was coming up out of the pod, I'm using the gouache more as watercolor. So you can see it's more translucent or transparent. So it really, really is versatile. And that's the thing that I love about it the most. I mean, down here, this is all pencil and I'm just wetting it. Before I even put any paint down. Get a little bit more yellow in there. Red. Those of you who have taken color theory know how to mix color, but I go over that in my classes. If you have a color wheel, that will help you as well. There's nothing like an old-fashioned paper color wheel to help you to mix colors. So now you see that red's really, really coming up. I don't want it there, so I'm just going to take my sponge. And, well, my water's kind of dirty, but it's picking it right up. So now when I go back over it with the green, that was a little too sweet, it will mix in with the red and I'll get the color that I want. And this is a super, super detailed brush. Okay, so if you want to get a larger area, and obviously you're going to use a larger brush. And I'm just going to take this whole thing and just put a wash over it. Oh, that red came back up again, so try to get it up. It's one of the hardest colors to get up, but it does. Also, if you use a complementary color to the color that the object actually is, it's going to make it pop. the thing, and that's the other thing that I love about gouache so much, the contrast really, really makes your work pop. So now it's getting deeper. Now, when I did it on the black paper, you have to use it more like acrylic. It has to be more opaque. You can't use as much water because what will happen is obviously the black is going to come through. So let's see if I have this color down right. What I did with this, when I work on black paper, I generally sketch it out with a white watercolor pencil, just so I could see what I'm doing. So it just has a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of water just to make the paint float. Now the black watercolor paper has a little bit more of a tooth to it, so you will have to add some water to it to make it flow over the surface. This is a little bit brighter, than what I had wanted. So what I'm going to do is finish filling this in, and then what I would do is let it dry, and then you can go over it. You can layer the colors, which is another great thing about gouache. You just have to be careful that you don't put too much paint on, because if you do, once the paint dries, it will crack. So what you see right here is the black paper coming through. Now, when this totally dries, I'm going to go back in with a little bit more yellow green and some white to match up what I did here previously. I just did this a little while ago, so I don't really remember all of the colors that I used. But basically on this, I always make notes on my work. So it's telling me here that the pencils I used were peacock blue and pear. I also used burnt sienna and white for the details. With the paint, I used primary blue, cypress green, chromium oxide, and olive green together to get the color that you see here. Now my water's all green, so let me go back up into here. When I did the when I did the flower part of it, the color was almost exact, which was really great. Yeah. There we go, right off the paper. See that? One thing I'm sure that you know, if you've ever painted before, change your water a lot. Like right now, it's very green, so I'm not going to go into the salt and pepper shakers, or I will just explain them, except for using the pencils. But this is, I don't know if I think the camera can pick it up. This is basically what it looks like when it comes out of the tube. It's really, really super thick. If you want to use it like watercolor, like I did on this piece, I started doing a landscape. This is gouache as well. Up, down, down.
This way.
Got it. Nope.
Put it flat. There we go.
Okay, there you go. All right, so you can see here that this was done. Look, I mean, if anybody looked at it, they would say it's watercolor, but it wasn't. It's gouache. But you can use it as watercolor if you so choose. So now I'm looking at this, coming over to here. This is black and white, so this is fairly easy as far as the color mixing goes. So I sketched all of this out in white, and then I used the white gouache with very, very little water. But I had to do 3 layers because you are putting white over black, so you want it to cover. Some of these highlights I did with my brush. If I want to add more, I could always use my watercolor pencil to get a little bit more of the white highlight. You can use it, the pencils over the paint. You can use it before you paint or after you paint. And depending on the brush, you can get different textures. Let me just put this aside for a sec. Can you reach it over here? So I'm just going to use the colors that I already have here. Just to show you a little bit of technique. Now, this is a flat wash brush. And this is how it looks on black paper. This is how it looks on white paper. So obviously it's a lot brighter on the white paper. However, if I let it dry on the black paper and do another layer or maybe 3 layers, I try not to do more than 3 layers because sometimes it just gets too goppy and it could crack on you. You will still get the solid color, just the way I did on the flower over there. And of course, depending on how you use the paint and how you handle your paintbrush, you're going to get all different types of textures. And that's a flat wash brush. Sometimes I love fan brushes. It's like a thing. So you just put the fan brush, just the tips of it. And this is a soft one. If you want to get a texture like that. And if you turn it around, you can get all kinds of interesting textures with it. Pick the brush up, put it back down. So that's the fan brush. Now, as far as getting little tiny dots or poncing goes, I use my handy little stencil brush. Probably cost me $2, but I've had it forever and it always works. Same deal. You take the brush and you put it on the paint, but just on the end of it. And I usually have a practice sheet of paper just to see how it's working for me before I decide to use it on a painting. So if you're doing a landscape, or you want grass or trees or things like that, or if you're doing the texture of the fabric. You hear that scrubbing sound? That's what a Ponce brush or a stencil brush is going to do for you. Then, of course, we have, where did I put it? No, this is the brush. My detail brush. When you're using a detail brush with gouache, you have to add a little bit more water than you would normally add. Sometimes you may have to give it another coat, but if you're very careful and make sure that you have enough pigment on the brush, it will come up. This is a dark green, so let me lighten it a little bit. See how it went right over it? The same thing will happen. If I use black on the white paper. Very, very little water, just enough to make the paint float. And that's another reason that I absolutely love gouache. It's like working with velvet. It just floats on the paper and it's so soothing and so meditative. And then, of course, you can take another brush, a wider brush. And you can reactivate it if you want to have a wash, just like watercolor.
I have a question from Paula Pelletier.
Okay.
Said, is it true that lights dry darker and darks dry lighter in gouache?
It depends on the color. Some colors, depending on what the binder is or what chemicals they're using to get that color, it will dry lighter and sometimes it'll dry darker. Red tends to get pink very, very quickly, so you don't want to use a lot of water with it unless that's what you're after. Blues and greens are a little bit more consistent. I would say that reds and pinks and oranges, you kind of really don't know. That's why I always have a piece of paper to play with before I start working on my sketch or my painting. This red that I have here, this is from the primary set. It's a little muddy now, but so it's going to be really, really dark on the white paper. And you'll hardly see it at all on the black paper unless you add some white to it. And I'm going to do it right on the paper. And as you can see, it turns pink very, very quickly.
So Paula's asking what brands you're using.
I use Winsor & Newton. I always have. I know that there is another brand or two out there that is a lot more expensive, but I find that Winsor & Newton is always reliable and the colors are always what they say they're going to be. I'm never unpleasantly surprised with Winsor & Newton paints, and I've been using them for a very long time. So that's what I suggest. When the classes start, I suggest that people get this set. It's just a little under $30. It has your primaries and black and white. And then I also suggest, where did I put it? I also suggest to get a tube of burnt sienna, because burnt sienna is used in almost any skin tone. It's also used in landscapes and water and forest scenes. I just use so much of this stuff. I'm constantly reordering it along with my black, along with my white, and sometimes my black. So if you start off with this set and just get one tube of burnt sienna, you can pretty much mix almost any color you want, once you are familiar with the color wheel. And if you know something about color theory, it'll be easier for you, obviously. But it's really just paying attention to your color wheel, mixing the colors in the amounts that it's telling you to mix, and learning what you like to use. Some people like really vibrant colors, and some people like things that colors that are very laid back or very quiet, very neutral. You can do that as well. I know they make cream colors and Payne's gray, but you can make those colors yourself with the primaries, your burnt sienna, your black, and your white.
Another question, what paper is used for gouache? Watercolor?
Yes, it's what I like to use, watercolor blocks, because this way the paper doesn't curl up when it gets wet. And this one, I don't remember what this one was, but this, oh yeah, here it is.
Is it hot or cold press?
I like the cold press because it's smoother. This black happens to be hot press because it was all I could get at the time. They were out of the other one, but I use the Arches paper. I find that's also, it always works beautifully. And I prefer it to a regular pad, as I said, because when you're using a regular pad, if your paper gets really wet, it's going to curl up on the edges. And once it does that, if you try to uncurl it, you may crack the paint. So that's why I always, you know, tell my students to stick with a color block, the watercolor block. This particular one is 140 pound, which is basically what almost everybody uses. It works perfectly fine for me. If I'm doing a very, very large piece and I need to buy the sheets of paper individually, I'll make sure that it's taped down to my board before I start painting on it. Even though it is very high quality paper, you still don't want it to curl up on you, because that can be really frustrating. But when you use it, when you're using gouache, once you get used to it and you see how versatile it is, and you start using your little sponges. I have tons of sponges in all different shapes, and all they are makeup sponges, and they're super absorbent. They don't damage your paper like other sponges do. I mean, they're super soft, just super soft and squishy, but really, really, really absorbent. I actually learned this when I was teaching at Parsons from one of my students. She took out her makeup bag and she took the sponge out, the eyeshadow sponge out, to just do a few things on her figure. And I said, "Oh, what are you using?" And she said, "Oh, it's a sponge. I always use these. They work great." And I was a little bit hesitant because I had always used natural sea sponges, but they can be very, very harsh on your paper, whereas these aren't. They're super, super soft, and they come in a million different shapes, and you can twirl them, squash them, move them around. They don't last forever, so you know, you can get a big bag of them for just a couple of dollars in the cosmetics section of any drugstore or a beauty supply store, or online, obviously, anywhere. And I find it to be really helpful. I find this to be more helpful than the masking fluid, to be honest with you, but that's a personal thing. Everyone has their own way of working. And everybody has the tools that they love the most, that they find that works for them. As I said, I have a heavy hand when I draw and when I paint. So, you know, I figured out over the years which tools work best for me. If you have a very light hand when you sketch out your work, then maybe you don't have to worry so much about a lead pencil leaving a mark on your page. But I will say this, when you're using watercolor paper, it is so absorbent that lead is not coming out. So unless you're working with a really, really light hand, I really don't think it's a great idea to sketch your work out with a lead pencil. I would much rather see people sketch their work out with a watercolor pencil. So at least that way it melts back in and you don't have to worry about getting it off the paper. So now my water's all green over here. Oh, and by the way, I usually have a little roll of saran wrap or cling wrap with me. If I can't finish something right away, it'll usually keep the paint fresh for about a week. After that, it'll start to harden and, you know, you'll just have to squeeze out some more paint. But once you start buying, once you get hooked on this paint, you're going to start buying tubes of this color and that color and, you know, yellow, orange and pinks and green, whatever. And it gets expensive, especially the ones that have chromium in them, which they try to outlaw, by the way, because it's toxic. But once it's in the paint, nothing's going to happen to you unless you decide to eat it, which that doesn't generally happen with artists. I mean, yeah, you wouldn't want to eat this. So you don't have to worry about the toxicity of it when it's in paint form. No worries there. The only thing that I will say is when you're painting, make sure you wear something that you don't really care about. Most colors will wash out with gouache because it is a water medium. Red and black, forget about it. Once it's on your clothes, it's never coming out. So that's why I'm dressed like this. I actually personally learned how to use this paint when I was at Parsons. I was a fashion illustration major because it was just so incredibly versatile in getting different types of textures and getting different types of fabric to look exactly the way they do. So once I got hooked on it, I work in acrylics as well. I work in watercolor as well. But I have to say gouache is definitely my favorite painting medium to use.
Betsy Stein has a question. She said, won't the hardened paint reactivate with water?
I'm sorry?
She's asking whether if the paint gets hard, can you reactivate it with water?
You can. You just need more water and have your sponge handy because it could run on you. So if it runs, the sponge will pick it right back up. And don't use too many layers because as I said, if you use more than 3 or 4 layers, I try not to use more than 3 layers. If you use more than that, once the paint dries, it can crack depending on the weather because it is thicker than watercolor and it doesn't have a latex base like acrylics do.
What she meant was if you reactivated on the palette, just so that you get.
Oh, well, that's a tricky question. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I really don't know why. All I could say is whatever they used to make the pigments in the first place probably has something to do with it. I find that when I'm painting in the summertime, if I'm outside or, if the air is very dry, it does dry quickly and gouache has a very, very matte finish to it. So you want to work more quickly when the air is drier. even when it's cold outside. You know, the heat is pumping, the air is dry, and your paint is going to dry more quickly. When it's raining outside, you can go more slowly because the humidity just gets into the air, it gets into your paint, it gets into the paper, and it won't dry as fast. So, as you can see on the salt and pepper shakers, which I did partially, when I did it on the white paper, and obviously it's not finished, when I did it on the white paper, I used it as a watercolor. So I used a lot of water. When I used it on the black paper, I had to do 2 to 3 coats to get the white onto the black and have it really be vibrant. So it really also depends on the color of the paper that you're using. Some manufacturers do make various colors in watercolor paper. I tend to be a little wary of that because it's generally pastel paper with another name. So make sure it says watercolor paper. And when you're using it on a block, you have no worries of the paper curling. Everything is going to stay exactly the way you put it down. You can't finish it. I learned this by accident. Try putting a spray varnish on it. No, you don't want to do that. It's going to put spots in your paint and it's going to change the color somewhat. So whatever you put down on the paper is, as they say, what you see is what you get. If you don't like the color, you can always go back in after it's dry and add either with your color pencils, your watercolor pencils rather, or pastels, or your sponge or water. There's a million different ways to play around with your paint once it's dry. It's super versatile, super versatile. That's why I use it almost exclusively. I mean, when I'm doing really large paintings, I do use acrylics. Sometimes they have gotten a lot better than they used to be. But it doesn't have the same feel. When you paint with gouache, you can just feel it just float on the paper. It just feels good. I don't know how else to put it. It just feels good painting with it. And it doesn't smell. So there's none of that. You don't need any medium. There are mediums you can use, but honestly, it's not necessary. If you know how to manipulate your paint, and it takes time, but once you learn how to manipulate your paint, you're good to go. So you just need your paint, your primaries, your black, your white, a tube of burnt sienna. Can't change your water all the time. It should not look like this. Generally, I have 2 or 3 water containers happening at the same time. So when I want my brushes to soak for a bit, I'll put it in a clean water container, because you don't want to leave your brushes like this. This is a good way to ruin them. It squashes the bristles. So when you want to clean your brushes, I like to use Dawn. I don't know why, but it just seems to work better than anything else as far as dishwashing soap. You know, with just some warm water, just put it in the palm of your hand, make sure all the color is out. If the bristles change color, don't worry about it. With synthetic brushes, and that's what almost all of us use now, because sable brushes are, well, you just might as well buy a new car if you want a whole set of sable brushes. So don't worry about it. Just test it and make sure that all of the pigment is out of it. Then I have a small thing, and everybody sells it. I think I brought it with me. I didn't. Of saddle soap. And when the brush is still wet, you just take it on the saddle soap and you go like this onto the brush, and that will keep the point on your round brushes and keep your bristles from going all over the place, so you don't have to keep buying new brushes. When you buy brushes, please don't go and buy the bag of 1,000,000 brushes for $1.99. because once you start using them, the hairs are going to fall out all over your work. They're not going to hold the water properly, and they're just going to make a mess, and you're going to be very unhappy. You're better off just spending a little bit more money, buying fewer brushes, getting brushes of a decent quality. I don't have one particular brand that I use. Basically, I'll feel it. And if it has a nice spring to it, this one I've had for a really, really long time. I know that it's gonna work for me. It's gonna be great. And then, of course, like everything else, things do wear out. You do have to buy a new one after a while, especially if you're painting a lot. When I get my new brushes, this one, I tried to save the plastic covers. And once I clean my brush, right now it has saddle soap on it, so it's really hard. But once then I start using it, and it gets wet and floppy, so I want to wash it. I want to put saddle soap on it, and then I just slip it back into the tube, and it'll last longer. But just like anything else, if you take care of it, it will take care of you.
And just to say, as Beth mentioned, she is going to be teaching a class on gouache painting at the Atelier.
Yes.
Anyone who's interested, you can find that class on our website, and that gives more details about it.
Right.
So
if you are a watercolor artist, it might be a fun thing just to try. You'd be surprised. People get hooked on it very, very quickly. It's just a wonderful medium. And that's why most illustrators, I don't know any illustrators that use other mediums. It photographs well, the colors are pure, they're consistent, and it's really a pleasure to use. You don't have to force it. If you're using it as watercolor, obviously, and you're doing a wash, you want to tilt your paper up. Always tilt your paper up so that it will fall. And then you can continue to brush and brush and brush and paint until it reaches the bottom. And then if it's still dripping, obviously take your sponge to pick up any of the residue. But more often than not, you have to add more. And you would use it just the way you would use watercolor.
I have a question about that. So Anna Castelli is asking, can you mix watercolor and gouache?
Yes, you can. You can mix gouache with watercolor, with ink, with pastels, with watercolor pencils. I wouldn't use regular colored pencils simply because they will act as a resist. So they won't mix in with the paint.
How do you avoid the chalky look? Less white?
Excuse me?
She's also asking, how do you avoid the chalky look? Less white?
Well, if you're working on black paper, it will look a little chalky. But you're not going to be staring at it that closely. I mean, once you have it in a frame hanging on the wall, you're not really going to notice it. But if you want that vibrancy, you always run the risk of the paint being a little bit chalky, because it does have a very matte finish to it. It doesn't have a sheen.
The same person is also asking, should watercolor be applied first due to its transparency? But I think you answered that in the beginning by saying if you water down gouache, it acts like a watercolor.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter.
And then someone else is also asking, what brushes do you prefer to use?
I don't have one particular brand that I like. Since most things are not made here, half the time you don't really know what brand you're getting unless you're spending quite a bit of money for specific brands of brushes. Personally, I don't really find that to be necessary. I mean, I will say that the sable brushes that I was taught with, I still have them, believe it or not, from art school, from college. But they're super expensive. I mean, if you want to spend over $100 for each brush, that's, certainly your prerogative. But these brushes have really come a long way, these synthetic brushes. If you feel the brush, any brush, okay, see how the shank is attached to the wood of the brush, touch the brush, see if it has some spring to it, pull on it, and see if any of the hairs are going to come out of it. None of those things happens here. And this brush was probably about $7, $8. And this is a 1/2-inch angular brush. Brushes come in a zillion different forms, shapes, sizes, widths, you name it. But my recommendation for people starting out would be to just get a nice wide wash brush, about this size. I guess it's about 3/4 of an inch to an inch wide. Get a nice round brush. And all a round brush means is it's rounded, it's clipped at the ends, and make sure it comes to a point when you move the hairs around on it. And a detail brush. And honestly, they're really not expensive anymore. They used to be super expensive, but they're not. If you take care of it and you wash it with the right soap and water, and you put your saddle soap on it, it's going to last you for quite a while. But the other thing is with brushes, what you store them in has a lot to do with how long they last. I don't even know how many brushes I have, but anyway, I keep my older brushes in a canvas roll. I'm sure you've seen them. Because I do use them when I want to get certain kind of funky techniques on some paintings. But the brushes, my favorite brushes, I like to use this type of a setup better because it protects your brush. I'll show you. And they sell these everywhere too. They're not hard to find at all. So it folds up and then it folds in half. That way, well, this is sticking out a little bit. I would make sure that that wasn't happening. Closes Velcro, and there you go. And you don't have to worry about it being squashed.
Anna Castelli is also asking about framing, and I think I can probably answer that too. Under glass is what I would say as far as framing goes. They are
Yes.
They are a watercolor.
Yes,
so,
they are water media,
Yeah.
treat it like watercolor, and yes, they should be under glass. Because if they get wet or something falls on it, there's nothing you can do about it. It's not like acrylic where you could paint over it again. It's not liquid plastic, it is water media. So if you aren't going to frame a piece that you have done or you haven't finished or you're not sure if you like it, I would suggest putting it in an acetate sleeve for protection. You know, the kind that they have in portfolios.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Atelier is asking, have you used acrylic gouache?
Ah, that's a good one. I honestly just tried acrylic gouache for the first time last year. It's a strange mix. It's a little bit of both. It's smoother than acrylics. However, I still found that I needed acrylic mediums to make the paint move the way I wanted it to. And it does have a little bit more, it has a nicer sheen, it has a higher sheen, but it is rather sticky, like most acrylics are. The good point about those kinds of paints is that you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to put it in an acrylic sleeve if you don't want to. You don't have to put it under glass. Artists that just primarily use acrylics on canvas, you don't have to do anything. Once it's on there, it basically seals itself because it's liquid polymer. So that's the advantage to that.
Okay. Betty Stein is asking, do you mix color on a palette or only on the paper?
Both. I'm a very intuitive painter. I mean, everyone is different. Everyone has their own style, and that is fine. That's the way it's supposed to be. But I'll put the colors on a palette that I think I'm going to use. If it's a rather small piece, as these are, and sometimes I'll mix them on the palette and I'll put it on the paper and I'll think, oh, gee, it needs a little bit more crimson and I want to add that to it. And then I'll just start mixing it on the paper. And as long as there's enough water on there, you can mix away, not a problem. It's very forgiving. It's very forgiving that way.
Okay, I've also got a question about the course you're offering. Can you talk about the course you're offering, and will it be offered on Zoom? Right now, we're not offering it on Zoom. That would be up to Beth, of course. But Beth, if you could talk a little bit about how you're going to teach the class.
Generally, I teach my classes in person. I don't have the proper equipment to make the colors come up right and the lighting, et cetera, where I live to do that. However, if there were enough people asking for it and I could do it here, I would have no problem doing it that way.
So so teaching in studio, how is your class going to be run?
Well, everybody would just be sitting down at at their table and getting all of their supplies out. I wouldn't worry too much about covering everything since it is a water-based media, unless you're using a lot of red, because that doesn't come out of anything. Set your brushes up and your water containers. As I said, I usually use 2 to 3 water containers, so I don't have to keep getting up and down and cleaning the water out. And always have some practice paper. Always have some practice paper so that you can see what's happening while you're doing it. You can see what's happening.
With your practice paper, is that a piece of the arches, or would you use?
Yes, it's a piece of the arches. Because if you use a different type of paper and then you go to the arches, you may get a different result. Mm-hmm. So you always want to practice on the surface that you're going to be painting on.
And do you normally paint from photographs, or would you be using a live?
Both. Both. Honestly, it depends on the students. Mm-hmm. Very often I'll get a mix of students, and some people want to do landscapes, some people want to do figures, still life, whatever it is that they want to do, I let them do, and I will help you with whatever it is that you want to paint, because I painted pretty much everything. But the only thing I don't really do is architectural paintings. That's, I think, is kind of a different type of a class. And being an intuitive painter doesn't really jive with my style, so to speak. However, if I get a request from a few people and they say to me, and did have this happen to me, I'm going to bring in a bunch of radishes. Can you help us with that? Sure. Bring them in, we'll put them on the table and go for it. Once you know color theory, at least the basics, and you have the right equipment, you can approach it any way you choose.
I hope that answers the questions. If anyone's got any other questions about the possible, the upcoming class, please feel free to put them in the chat room. That's, as I say, that's coming up soon. That will start on, I believe it's Friday. It'll be March the 3rd, I believe. 10:30 to 1:30. And you can find details on the website.
Okay, great. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to email us here, and they will forward it to me, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions for you. Because I want it's very important to me that my students are enjoying what they're doing. And I don't want anybody to feel, oh my God, I can't draw a straight line. I can't do this. I did one painting that I loved once. I don't know if I could do it again. You know, we're not submitting, well, maybe some people are. I have taught in situations where the class was a lot of professionals. But if you're not a professional and you're not submitting your work for review in a gallery, or you're not doing it as an illustration for a company, if you don't like it, it's paper. Just get another piece of paper and start again. I wish I had a nickel for every piece of paper that wound up in the garbage that I didn't like, either starting out painting it or finishing it and thinking I did a great job, and waking up the next day and looking at it and saying to myself, ugh, I hate this. So just try not to keep pressure on yourself. The whole idea is to enjoy it. The whole idea is to enjoy the process of painting. And if you love it and you feel that you have a talent or a knack for it and you want to continue with it, then you go on from there. And then I would give you different advice, because I've worked professionally, as well as I worked professionally before I became a teacher, so I could answer those questions for you as well. And I just want my students to enjoy themselves. It's a crazy world out there. So when you're dealing with beautiful colors and painting something that you enjoy, it's a wonderful way to spend your time.
Dorothy Thrum just says thank you.
Oh,
and
you're
I
quite
do
welcome.
hope you check out Beth's class on the website. I think you might well find it very interesting. Anna Castelli also says thank you.
Oh, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. I love teaching. It's fun for me. It's not just something that I do because I have to do it. Even though I did begin my career as a teacher, I began professionally. I learned so much from my students. I learn almost as much from my students as they learn from me. And I'm always open to any ideas.
Betsy Stein also says thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we will wrap this up. So I would like to thank Beth very much for such an interesting demonstration and talk about her class, which, as I say, is starting at the Atelier in studio, Friday, March the 3rd. If anyone is interested, you can call us if you have any questions, and you can also check it out on our website, which is atelierflowerfield.org. Our next lecture will be March 16th, and will be given, it's titled Siqueiros and His Influence on the Art of Jackson Pollock. And I would also urge you to look out for our emails about our lectures, our exhibitions, and any other upcoming events and classes. We are currently in the process of planning some one-day workshops, which we hope to hold over the summer. So that's something to look out for. So we hope we will see you in the studios. And I thank Beth very much. This was a great introduction to gouache painting. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.